If you're studying philosophy and ethics, then subscribe. I'm covering the entire content in this channel. Virtue ethics. Almost every ethical theory you've studied so far asks the same fundamental question: what should I do? Utilitarianism asks, what action produces the greatest happiness? Kantian ethics asks, what duty reason commands? Situation ethics asks, what love requires in this particular case? Virtue ethics asks something different, something more fundamental. Not what should I do, but what kind of person would I be? And that shift changes everything. Instead of a rulebook or a calculation, you get a picture of a whole human life. Instead of asking whether this specific action is right or wrong, you ask whether this person is developing the character they need to live well. And this is Aristotle's ethics, which is developed in his Nicomachean Ethics, written around 350 BCE, and still is one of the most influential works in the history of moral philosophy. And with exams approaching, this video will give you everything that you need: the full theory, key scholars, the evaluation, the essay structure, and the exact terminology that earns marks. So there are three things you need to know right from the start. Virtue ethics is not deontological. It's not about following universal duties or rules. It is not consequentialist. It is not about calculating the best outcome. But it is character-centered. It's about cultivating excellent dispositions over a complete human life. Keep those three distinctions in your mind throughout everything that we look at. To understand why Aristotle places virtue at the center of ethics, you need to understand his function argument, because it's the philosophical foundation on which everything else rests. Aristotle observes that everything has a telos, a natural purpose or function. A knife's telos is to cut well. An eye's telos is to see clearly. A musician's telos is to play beautifully. And in each case, something is good when it fulfills its natural function excellently. So what is the telos of a human being? Well, Aristotle's answer is eudaimonia, a Greek word usually translated as happiness or flourishing, but neither translation quite captures it. Eudaimonia is not a feeling. It is not pleasure or momentary satisfaction or getting what you want. No, it's a complete, excellent human life, living and faring well as the kind of being a human being is over time. And this is the highest good, to which all other good aims. Wealth is good because it enables flourishing. Health is good because it enables flourishing. Friendship, knowledge, honor, all these things are all good insofar as they contribute to or constitute a flourishing in human life. And here is the crucial philosophical move that distinguishes virtue ethics from everything else that you've studied in ethics. Living virtuously is not a means to eudaimonia, something you do in order to achieve flourishing. It is constitutive of eudaimonia. Virtue and flourishing are the same thing viewed from different angles. You do not first become virtuous and then reap the reward of flourishing later on. The virtuous life just is the flourishing life. And here's the exam alert I've put on this slide, and it does matter a lot. Eudaimonia is not pleasure or happiness in the everyday sense. Do not write about it in those terms. It is a complete, excellent human life lived over time. So don't ever reduce it to the feeling of feeling good. So now that we know why virtue matters, because it's constitutive of eudaimonia, we need to know what a virtue actually is. A virtue is an excellence of character. More precisely, it is a stable disposition to feel, think, and act in appropriate ways in relevant circumstances. And notice that word stable that I used. Virtues are not one-off acts. They are deep, settled features of who you are. The reliable tendencies that define your character across different situations over time. Aristotle distinguishes two types of virtue ethics, and the distinction will matter for your essays. The first on the slide is intellectual virtues. These are developed through teaching and instruction. The most important intellectual virtue is phronesis, which is practical wisdom. And we're going to come to that shortly. You develop intellectual virtues by being taught, by reasoning, by learning from experience. And then we have moral virtues, and these are acquired through your habits. This is one of Aristotle's most important insights, and it's one examiners will constantly look for. We do not first become courageous and then start doing courageous things. We become courageous by doing courageous things repeatedly until courage becomes our second nature. And a settled feature of character that operates reliably and without effort. Now, the word ethics in Greek comes from ethos, meaning character. And ethos is closely related to the word for habit. Aristotle is making an etymological point as well as a philosophical one. Ethics is fundamentally about character, and character is fundamentally about habit. So the key virtues in this specification, across all of them in fact, are courage, justice, temperance, generosity, honesty, and practical wisdom. You need to know these by name, and you need to be able to explain each one of them in terms of the doctrine of the mean, which brings us to this next slide. The doctrine of the mean is the most visually memorable ideas in the whole ethics course, and the diagram on this slide captures it perfectly. Every virtue is the mean between two corresponding vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. So let's look at these examples. Courage, let's take courage in the center there, is the mean between cowardice, which is the deficiency of the relevant disposition, and recklessness, which is the excess of it. Now, imagine a courageous person will feel the right amount of fear in a dangerous situation and will respond appropriately. But if they have too little fear, they become reckless. And if they have too much fear, they become cowardly. Take a look at generosity. It's the mean between miserliness and prodigality. Miserliness is the deficiency, and prodigality the excess. The generous person gives the right amount to the right people at the right time. They're not too frugal, miserliness, and they're not too excessive, and blasé, prodigality. Look at temperance at the bottom. That's in between the mean between insensibility, the deficiency of the capacity for pleasure, and self-indulgence, the excess. So you can see it's looking for striking the balance between extremes. The exam tip that's on your slide here, you need to take seriously. Always name both vices when you discuss any of the virtues. An examiner reading an answer that identifies courage as a virtue without mentioning cowardice and recklessness is going to be reading an answer that operates typically below a level 3. If you name the excess and you name the deficiency and you explain the mean between them, you are going to do much better. Now, one more thing that is philosophically crucial. The mean is not a mathematical midpoint. It's not the perfect exact halfway between two extremes, because that would be impossible. It's what is appropriate for this particular person in this particular situation. So if you're a trained soldier and a first-time volunteer face the same danger, you are going to face it differently. If you're the trained soldier and there's somebody else who is a first-time volunteer, that danger is going to be approached differently. Now, what counts as the appropriate response will vary with the context, the experience, and the circumstance. So that trained soldier will have a different mean to some extent than the first-time volunteer. You would expect perhaps the first-time volunteer to have a little bit more fear, maybe, than the trained soldier. Now, this is where phronesis, which is the practical wisdom, comes into play. On the bottom left of the slide, there's the definition. Phronesis is the intellectual virtue that identifies the mean in each specific case. It's the capacity for you to reason well about what matters most in particular situations rather than applying a universal formula in a very mechanical way. And this makes it the master of virtue. And without it, none of the other virtues get exercised correctly. So let's have a look at phronesis. It deserves its own mention because it's the most important and most frequently misunderstood concept in virtue ethics. Practical wisdom is not having knowledge of the rules. It is not the ability to apply a formula. It is a developed capacity for sound moral perception, seeing what matters in a particular situation and responding in the way that good character requires. Think of the difference between a junior doctor and a senior consultant. Both of them have the same medical knowledge, but the consultant has something more. They've got a cultivated ability to read a complex clinical situation, weigh competing considerations, and act with the judgment that experience and character will have developed. And that is phronesis in the medical domain. Moral phronesis is the same capacity applied to the ethical life. Now, the virtuous person is not someone who follows a rulebook correctly. The virtuous person is someone whose character is so well developed that they naturally perceive what virtue requires and they naturally do it. They don't reluctantly do it or from a place of fear or punishment, but they do it because virtue has become part of who they are. And this is the moral standard virtue ethics proposes. Not a categorical imperative that you apply mechanically. Not a hedonic calculus that you run on each situation, but a person, a human being of excellent character, whose life exemplifies what flourishing looks like. And the unity of the virtues, the claim that genuine possession of one virtue requires all of the others, follows from this. You see, you cannot be truly courageous without being just, because courage deployed unjustly becomes mere aggression. And you cannot be generous without also being temperate, because generosity without self-control just becomes prodigality. And the virtues are not a list of separate qualities. They form an integrated whole in a person of fully developed character. So virtue ethics is not just ancient history. In the 20th century, there were three philosophers revived and transformed the tradition. And all three of these people are essential for you to mention in your higher band essays. Let's start with Philippa Foot. Now, Philippa argued that virtues are forms of natural goodness. Drawing on biology and human nature, she held that virtues are beneficial traits that enable humans to flourish as the kinds of beings that they are. Just as sharp teeth enable wolves to flourish as wolves. And this grounds virtue ethics in something objective: human nature, without requiring mysterious non-natural moral properties. It connects virtue ethics to the naturalist tradition in meta-ethics, and it gives it a philosophical foundation that purely traditional accounts lack. Next we have Alistair MacIntyre. In his work After Virtue in 1981, he made a bold diagnosis of modern moral philosophy, and it is fragmented, incoherent, and incapable of resolving genuine moral disagreements because it has lost the context that once gave moral concepts their meaning. Virtue, MacIntyre argued, only makes sense when it is embedded in social practices and narrative traditions, the ongoing stories of communities and individuals that give actions their significance. Now, without that embedding, virtue simply becomes a word without a world. And thirdly, Elizabeth Anscombe. Her paper, Modern Moral Philosophy in 1958, is the essay that effectively launched the modern revival of talking about virtue ethics. Anscombe argued that concepts like moral obligation and duty are remnants of a theological framework, divine law, that modern secular philosophy has simply abandoned. And without the lawgiver, the language of duty becomes incoherent. And so her solution was to return to Aristotelian virtue and flourishing as the proper framework for ethics. Now, citing these three thinkers in your essays and explaining what each of them contribute will demonstrate your wider reading, and it will definitely give you higher marks, because they show the examiner that you understand virtue ethics as a living, developing tradition rather than just an ancient historical curiosity from thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. So let's now evaluate with the same philosophical seriousness that we brought to every other theory the strengths of virtue ethics. It is agent-centered rather than act-centered. Virtue ethics focuses on the whole person over time, not on isolated decisions or individual actions. And this captures something morally important that rule-based and consequence-based theories will simply miss. Character matters. Who you are matters. A morally serious life is not a series of correct decisions. It is sustained commitment to becoming a person of and being of excellence. Secondly, it is flexible and contextually sensitive. Phronesis responds to genuine moral complexity in a way that rigid rules cannot. Real moral situations involve particular people in particular circumstances with their own histories and relationships. So virtue ethics has the resources to respond to this complexity through practical wisdom, rather than forcing every situation through a formula that simply wasn't designed for it. Thirdly, motivationally realistic. Virtue ethics asks who to be rather than what rule to follow. And this reflects how people genuinely think about their moral lives. Most people are not primarily asking, what does the categorical imperative require? They're asking, what kind of person do I want to be? And what would someone I admire do here? So virtue ethics speaks to this directly. And finally, it's compatible with religious ethics. The virtue tradition connects naturally to theological accounts of human nature, divine purpose, and the good life. Natural law theory, for example, shares Aristotle's teleological framework, because Aquinas also talked about telos, having a purpose. What's the ultimate aim? And so Christian ethics has always emphasized character formation alongside moral rules. And that makes virtue ethics one of the most theologically relevant and resonant secular ethical frameworks. a significant advantage in your essays for religious studies. But what are the weaknesses of virtue ethics? Well, it's too vague to guide your actions. The instruction to do what the virtuous person would do offers very little practical help when you are facing a genuine dilemma for the very first time, or when you are not yet very virtuous, or when virtuous people themselves disagree about what that situation requires. Other theories, however rigid they may be, at least tell you what to do. Virtue ethics tells you who to be, which presupposes you already know how to be that person. We also have the issue of cultural relativism. Whose virtues are they? Different societies across history have identified different character traits as virtues. Aristotle's list reflects the values of ancient Athenian aristocratic culture. Courage in a warrior society looks very different from courage in a pacifist community today. If virtue is culturally embedded, as MacIntyre himself argues, then it risks collapsing into moral relativism. What counts as flourishing for one society may be entirely different from what counts as flourishing for another. And we also have the exclusion problem. Aristotle's original account excluded women, slaves, and non-Greeks from full moral consideration. And these groups of people were held to lack the rational capacity for full virtue and eudaimonia. And this is not a peripheral flaw, it is built into the original theory. Modern virtue ethicists have tried to address this, but the historical record is a serious problem that just you can't simply set aside. It's historically problematic. And we have the circulatory problem. The virtuous problem is the moral standard, but to identify who is virtuous, you need to know what virtue is. The standard is circular. This isn't fatal, but it is a genuine philosophical difficulty that the theory needs to address more directly than it actually does. So here's the exam tip. For essay purposes, the most analytically productive weaknesses will be vagueness in dilemmas and cultural relativism, because they generate the most sustained chains of reasoning. So use one of them as your main AO2 focus. So 3 comparative contrasts are here, each of which generates powerful essay material. Let's have a look at virtue ethics versus Kantian ethics for a moment. Kant focuses on the isolated act. Is this specific action in accordance with this duty? Virtue ethics focuses on character. Is this person developing the dispositions that constitute a good life? Kant's ethics are universal and inflexible. The categorical imperative applies to everyone in every situation without exception. Virtue ethics is contextually sensitive. Phronesis responds to particular circumstances. And both will take morality seriously, but they disagree fundamentally about what the subject matter of ethics actually is. Well, what about virtue ethics versus utilitarianism? Utilitarianism asks what you do, which actions produce the best consequences. Virtue ethics asks who you are, which character traits constitute excellent humanity. Now, utilitarianism will measure outcomes mathematically and treat motivation as irrelevant to moral worth, whereas virtue ethics places motivation, acting from settled virtue rather than calculation, at the very center of moral evaluation. And where utilitarianism risks treating people as receptacles for utility, virtue ethics insists that human flourishing is intrinsically valuable, not reducible to any calculation. And what about virtue ethics versus situation ethics? Well, both of them are flexible and people-centered. Both of them resist rigid universal rules, and both of them respond to the complexity of specific situations. But virtue ethics provides a framework of character, stable virtuous dispositions that orient and guide moral perception, whereas situation ethics relies entirely on the single criterion of agape. And that makes virtue ethics more structured whilst remaining contextually sensitive. So the essay structure that will serve you best is this 5-step sequence. Place virtue ethics in the teleological tradition. It's about your purpose. Explain the function argument and eudaimonia. And then evaluate using the strongest objection with a full chain of reasoning, and that's important. And then compare it with one alternative theory like we've just done. And then reach a reasoned conclusion that defends a clear position. So here are some of the types of questions you will face across all 3 exam boards. Critically assess virtue ethics as an approach to moral decision making. To what extent is the concept of eudaimonia central to virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is too vague to be useful. Discuss. Evaluate the claim that virtue ethics is a better guide to morality than Kantian ethics. Think about the pattern here. Every question asks you to evaluate. Every question asks you to assess a claim, to weigh a position, to reach a reasoned verdict. And that means your answer needs to do more than describe the theory accurately. It needs to deploy the strongest objections, engage with possible responses, and arrive at a defended conclusion. And here are the most important pieces of advice for the topic. The most common error and the one that costs the most marks. Students describe virtue ethics without grounding it in the function argument. They list courage, justice, temperance, and generosity, and never explain why virtues matter. And that requires the function argument, telos, and eudaimonia. So always establish the teleological framework first, because everything in virtue ethics depends on it. And here are the must-know terms that you can't afford to be vague about. Telos, eudaimonia, phronesis, the 3 pillars of the theory. The doctrine of the mean, which contains excess and deficiency, the structure of virtue. Habituation, unity of the virtues, how virtues are acquired and how they relate to each other. And don't forget the 3 modern philosophers, Foote, MacIntyre, and Anscombe. The modern scholars who demonstrate the theory is alive and is developing. So know these terms, use them precisely, ground every answer in the function argument, and you're as well prepared for this topic as you can ever be.